This is the Cedar Creek Church Living It Out podcast, a midweek reminder where we discuss key takeaways and principles from the weekend message to help you live out the truth that you matter.
Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to the Living It Out podcast, a weekly podcast to remind you that you matter and to help you live out that truth throughout the week. My name is Casey. I'm your host, and I'm here today with our lead pastor, Ben Snyder, and Alex Woody, our senior director of family ministries. How you guys doing today?
You sound fantastic.
I know. Doesn't this sound so good?
This is amazing.
I know. We are in our studio for the first time. If you're watching the video, you can see this. If you're just listening, you're probably wondering, wow, you guys sound a lot better. It's because we're in a closed room with soundboards on the walls and cool microphones and headphones.
Super professional.
We got an amazing team.
I know, we really do. They put this together in like 2 weeks, which is impressive. It's very impressive. Yeah. But we are excited to be here today. We continued in our series called The Knot this past week. And we had a fun conversation this past weekend. Ben, I'm just going to kick it to you. I'm not even going to tell everybody what we talked about. Why don't you just tell us what we talked about this weekend?
So, my son invited one of his friends to church for the first time, and they came this weekend. I'm not sure they've ever been to Cedar Creek, family and everything. And so as I was walking out for that service, I got a text that they were in house, and I'm like, oh boy, buckle up, because we're in week 2 of the knot. And we just talked about, if two are going to become one and love it, at some point you got to talk about sex.
Absolutely.
And marriage, sex, and divorce, and what does Jesus kind of teach about all that?
Yeah, that's so good. And I think a question too, maybe people are wondering, like, why would you talk about that at church? Because that might not be something we're used to talking about at church.
Yeah, that's weird to me. In part because Cedar Creek has played such a key role. If you can't talk about it at church or among Christians, I think that's where sadly the church may have gotten sideways. It's not bringing voice to these issues, and when you don't, then our tendency is to look at what everybody else is saying about the subject. You come to a bunch of assumptions, and so I think it was a refreshing topic, although for some, I know it was awkward, unexpected, but the truth is I want the church to be the safest place on the planet to talk about these things, and also to break, if it was God's idea to begin with, he should get some of the credit for it. So, thanks, dude.
No, it's great. And Alex, like I mentioned earlier, is our senior director of family ministry, so you oversee all of kids and all of student ministries. Obviously, this is a conversation that parents have to have too. So I guess why is this important for students to even be talking about?
Yeah, we're actually going to be having a series here in March.
We are. You're right.
Middle school, and then talking about dating and relationships with our high school students and all that. It's huge because they see it everywhere, and they don't just see it; they hear about it, or their friends are talking about it or involved in it. Social media, any TikTok, Snapchat, all things that parents, I think we wish we could monitor better than we do. And those things are just there, blatantly out there. All the different phrases now that students use that we can never keep up with as we get older and older. I'm like, don't think of myself as an adult, but I guess I am.
You are an adult, Alex.
And it's just there. And so if we don't start talking about it with our students before their friends and media and all that stuff hits them with it, well then they'll go to all the wrong places and all the wrong people.
Yeah.
And so we want to be there for them.
Absolutely. And our heart behind that too, I think from a family ministry's perspective, is we want to equip parents to be able to have those conversations. And I think, Ben, this weekend you did a great job of setting that up and giving parents some great content to talk about. And we'll talk through that here as we get going in the podcast. But first, I want to elevate the tension that for some reason sex is either overvalued or undervalued. Talk a little bit about what that looks like in our culture and even in our church culture.
Yeah, this weekend we had a fun clip, dry bar comedy I found on YouTube of like taking a couple shower, and you have these ideas of what it's going to be like, only to have it not be like that at all. Right. And I think for anybody who's experienced that, it's like he nailed it. It was great.
It's so funny.
And so we have these expectations that don't always deliver, or we have these images, or certainly in media, like the movies that we watch, or even within pornography, there's this concept of this is what is real and it's not.
Sure.
And so if we're not careful, we will overvalue what sexuality can do for us, or what it will look like, how it will satisfy, or we undervalue it and miss the spiritual significance. I think one of the I didn't talk about this every service, but one of the groups that I was thinking about are people who are single too. It's like, well, a single second class, that is potentially an overvaluing of sexuality. Jesus has this obscure comment about eunuchs that I don't have time to get into now, but it's like he's basically saying, you know what, sometimes people are biologically unable to, or maybe they choose not to. Single is not second class. God cares about every single person. And I know married couples, too, that for whatever reason can't engage in sexuality the way that is often portrayed. That doesn't mean their marriage is second class either. And so let's not overvalue it. Yeah. But at the same time, this is something that God invited married couples to experience. Let's not undervalue it either.
That's so good. And Alex, in the context of students and kids, like what does it look like to under and overvalue that? And where do we see that happening even in culture right now?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think our culture would definitely be pushing that. At the end of the day, the earthly appetites are what we have to be satisfying. Sure. Go after it. That's what's going to make you happy, or that's what's going to bring you what you're looking for, especially as you're in high school and getting on to your life in college and beyond. I mean, that's what the world says you need, basically. And so they find it. You're going to find it everywhere, right? Yeah. I mean, any of the music you turn on, for the most part, is going to have some sort of lyrics that are talking about it. I mean, some of the most popular guys right now, Post Malone, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
right.
It's not as blatant as it might have been in certain music in the past, but man, they're always leaning into it and that, and media and television.
Yeah. So it's everywhere. It's a conversation we need to be having. It's a gift from God, so we should be talking about it in the context of church. There is this tension. We do see it undervalued. We see it overvalued. And Ben, this weekend, your bottom line was earthly appetites cannot satisfy spiritual hunger. I love that bottom line because nowhere in there do you say anything about sex.
That's
so
right.
I think this bottom line transcends that a little bit. But talk about that in the context of sex, but also outside.
Yeah, I think we all have desires. And so what that acknowledges is we all come to the table or come to a relationship with hopes, expectations, earthly appetites. And honestly, they're all going to be different, like frequency and all of the stuff, that comes with that. No matter who you are, it's going to be a little bit different. Let's not falsely assume, though, that they are going to provide sometimes what we think they will. That means that not only do we come to a relationship with earthly appetites, we also come to a relationship with the spiritual hunger. And the way that I think that's easiest to define is we all want to be loved and accepted with no strings attached. Or the way it says it in Genesis chapter 2 is we all want to be naked and have no shame. And I'm not just talking about physical nakedness, but like a life of authenticity where I can be myself and not have guilt, hurt, shame, any of those other things that are associated with that. So if we're not careful, we'll look at sex or we'll look at someone else to satisfy that. We'll let our earthly appetites drive that instead of first going, okay, God, what's the work that you need to do in me?
Yeah, that's so good. And again, that doesn't necessarily just mean when it comes to sex, but such a great principle to be talking about. And Alex, I keep coming to you for the student perspective on things, but this is your job, and you're constantly thinking through how do we take what Ben talks about on the weekend or whatever the curriculum calls for, and how do we put that in a context for our students? So this bottom line, what does that look like for students? What does that look like for middle school students who are struggling with this? How do we realize that those earthly desires do not satisfy our spiritual hunger? Yeah,
and I think that's actually what we're going to dive into in the whole month of March with students, because it's a lot more broad than just like we're not talking about the birds and the bees for 4 weeks.
It's not a biology series, right?
It's not. It's like, hey, we're talking about at the end of the day, God created sex, and it's good.
It's beautiful,
and
right?
It's right in the right context, and so we have to understand that first, so that way you're not kind of buying into all the different lies that get thrown at you. We're going to talk about technology and pornography and all that, because that's a way students will run. It's often the statistic is the average student is viewing pornography by the age of 11 or seeing it on some sort of basis.
Let's stop there a second, because I think for a lot of people listening, if you have kids, I don't think we sometimes always understand that. Like that's 4th, 5th grade. That students are watching porn for the first time, pornographic material, and that's
it's. I mean, you don't have dial-up internet anymore. You have the phone in your hands,
right.
So many.
And if they have questions about things, where are they going to go? Typically,
they're going to go to Google.
They're going to go to Google, and so we've got to be talking about it. We have to be
absolutely
so important. A great point.
So we're going to dive into all that, boundaries within dating relationships, because as much as even as a parent, I don't want to admit it. Like my daughters one day are going to find a boy cute or something, and like they are told by all their friends that these are things you do or how you do it and why, and so we want to dive into all that and get a better understanding that it's okay to talk about that, especially with our group leaders here at the church.
Absolutely.
And then ultimately, we have a lot of materials that we'll put on our website for parents as well.
Yeah.
So they can step into those conversations. We actually have a parent guide that goes through how to talk to your middle school student about these topics.
So helpful. Yeah.
And I would say the way that you start navigate, for those of you that are parents, the way that you navigate or start talking about your romantic life without all the details, and the way that you begin having conversations with your children at a young age is what honestly sets the stage for them when they're teenagers.
Totally.
If you're looking for a resource, I know I'm going through the guy's body book with my son. There's a girl's body book. And just I don't agree. There are parts of it, like they have this chapter on tattoos. I have tattoos. They're like, hey, don't get a tattoo. Or they're actually trying to inform kids to make good decisions. It's like, so I'm like, I like the conversation on that. There's a lot of topics that they talk about from like puberty, but then it gets more and more specific about sexuality and all of that, or what your body, the changes that your body's going to go through. And so the more you can have that conversation, as awkward as it may feel for some of you, the more life-giving that can be, then you begin to lay the foundation for your teens to talk about it down the road.
So important to do. Yeah. So important to do. That's great.
Build that trust.
Yeah, absolutely. It builds trust, and I think we talk about group leaders are doing that too, to have that conversation with kids and students. So if you are a parent, I would encourage you to reach out to your kids and your student director at your campus. They would love to help you navigate these conversations. They really, really would, and that's why they're there. We're going to transition a little bit. Ben, this weekend you talked about God's intent for marriage. I think even those 3 words sometimes can bring thoughts into our minds. So how do you define that this weekend?
Yeah, I think this is where it gets personal. Honestly, when you start talking about God's intent at the very beginning, before Adam and Eve ate the fruit, it's simple. It's a man plus woman plus technically children. The first command is be fruitful and multiply for life. It's like God's design from the beginning was that men and women would come together and have families, have children, and that they would stay in that relationship together. I said this weekend, like, God should really get the credit for Marvin Gaye's Let's Get It On. I mean, it was God's idea, which is fun, but God also wanted to begin this process by which we would experience new life, and you can see that biologically. So you start to ask the question, well, then, what about divorce? Or what if we can't have kids? Or what if I'm same-sex attracted? And what does that mean? Essentially, after Adam and Eve and what you would call the fall, there's all sorts of ripple effects that have happened that we honestly are now processing. We're trying to figure out, how do we navigate our reality, whatever that is, in a way that's going to kind of honor God. And those are complicated and difficult, and sometimes it can be confusing. And so, for us at Cedar Creek, we want the church to be the safest place on the planet to talk about this stuff, which means we're probably not always going to even agree or fully understand. How do we make sure that first we're pointing people to the life-changing adventure that Jesus has for it? Let's not over or undervalue sexuality over that. That's the top priority, and then go from there.
And you shared a story this weekend of Jesus being asked some of the little detail questions.
Yeah.
And we'll get into that more in a second, but I think you made a great point. We oftentimes want those details. We want to know the whats. We want to know the hows, right? But most of the time there's a bigger thing going on that Jesus is kind of teaching. So we'll get to that in a second. So good.
We all experience that when we're growing up, right? When we're teenagers, like how far?
How far is too far?
That's all we care about. That's all students want to know.
Absolutely. I can't tell you how many times the kids in my group ask that question. Like, how far is too far?
Yeah.
Like,
what's permissible?
Absolutely.
Those questions are great, but they're typically motivated by earthly appetite.
Absolutely.
And I think that's the key. Okay, so it's like, if I'm not careful, I'll bring all my earthly appetite questions to God. Like, how many M&Ms am I actually allowed to have? Or how far is too far? Is this actually sex, or is this not sex? Or pornography isn't hurting anybody. I hear that it's not really hurting anybody, and so then we get into these kinds of debates, or.
And not that those debates are bad necessarily. It can be very helpful conversation, but when you get lost in that, you forget the why. And so we're going to take a little bit of a turn to the why. We talk about a biblical sexual ethic. Let's walk through that a little bit and give our listeners just an idea of what we talked about this weekend, and maybe even like ways that practically could be lived out.
Yeah, I think, again, when it comes to a biblical sexual ethic, this isn't going to be like, so this is going to give you the precise step that you need to take.
Right.
And this is what's hard. So the first one is, to honor God with your body. For those of us who are Jesus followers, we believe that our body, physical, mental, and spiritual being is not ours. It's God's. God created it. If you're not following Jesus, you're probably letting your earthly appetites drive, and you're trying to control or moderate those, which is fine. But as Jesus followers, we're like, okay, we want to honor him first. It's not what do I want to do, it's what does he want me to do. The second framework is don't be mastered by anything, and I think this is interesting with students, right? Students don't know that they should be afraid of being mastered by something, and so they're a little naive when it comes to that. If you've ever been mastered by something, you know how dangerous that can be, and it really does. Those two things together begin to limit oneness in our relationships.
Yeah, well, I feel like when you're mastered by something too, and I'm speaking to experience being a high school student, being mastered by something, you don't really realize it. The choices you're making every day are actually being mastered by this other choice that you constantly make all the time. And so that's, again, I'll speak to this. That's why I think our group leaders are so important, is they're providing a safe place for students and kids to talk about anything.
I'm struggling with this.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Also another view where a lot of times you just won't accept your parents' view on that's right, wrong, shouldn't do that. So then when you hear another person that you respect come in, and they kind of also speak to it.
Absolutely. What a beautiful thing the group leader can do, support the parent in these conversations around not being mastered by these things. Because ultimately, it's not because God tells us not to, yes, but also because it has earthly consequences to it. And so I think that I love that second biblical sexual ethic. I think that's really important, especially for students to be learning about.
Honestly, I know it's important for students to learn about, but adults don't think they're mastered by anything.
Right.
So true.
Or when we hear that, our tendency is to think drug addiction. It's like, oh, I'm addicted to. I'm not really mastered by anything. When in reality, it could be I'm mastered by this need to have someone in my life, or I'm mastered by the public approval of others, or I need my kids to love me. I need to have enough. Anything that begins to have more authority than God is something that we're really letting dictate the direction of our life.
Yeah.
And that can't help but weave its way into our relationship, not just with God, but with other people. And I think God invites us to find freedom from that stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. So the third biblical sexual ethic, don't sexualize your relationship outside of marriage.
And I think this sounds archaic. It sounds like we're trying to recover maybe the Puritans or something like that. It's like, oh, isn't that old school? And interesting stat that I heard is that 8 out of 10 relationships where people are living together end up 8 out of 10. So that's 80%. 8 out of 10 relationships where they are living together before they're married end up broken up or divorced.
Why do you think that is?
Well, I mean, there's lots of speculation.
Sure.
What's interesting is the reason people are living together is because they feel like getting married is too costly. It doesn't really mean you're committed, but your statistics of staying together go up.
Yeah.
You know, we think living together, you got to test drive it before you try it. And the truth is, if you're going into a relationship with not wanting to really, let me say it this way. You're not saying this, but if you're going into a relationship afraid of commitment, then you're going into the relationship afraid of staying with the person you're with.
You have that opt-out option. Right? And when you're married to somebody, you don't. I mean, you do, but you don't. You're committed to them.
It's just a different, we talked about this in week 1. It's a different foundation.
Yeah.
Like, I'm not going into this based on how you make me feel.
Totally.
I'm not letting my earthly appetites drive. Instead, I have a different foundation. And so I think this is why some people, if sexuality or their sex lives is a key driver for this, it's like, hey, when you're not pleasing me sexually anymore, I'm out. I'm going to look for a newer, younger, hotter, whatever, exciting. What we're not talking about it anymore. And it just starts to get sideways.
Yeah. Wow. That's great. I love the way you walk through each of these, because I think you can read these and at face value, they can be taken one way. But as you start to really peel back the layers, they're applicable in all of our areas of life, which is so good in all of our lives, no matter what stage of life that we're in. We're going to transition in, like, how do we, I'm going to laugh here, like, how do we live this out? So we
tell us, Ben.
Yeah, Ben, how do we live out this biblical sexual ethic? But I think practically, like, you gave us some homework this weekend, but somehow Alex and I are still in the office. So
that's right. Well, it's not Tuesday, so maybe you're
Tuesday.
You're saving it for tomorrow.
I thought you said it was Monday. You're giving us.
I gave Monday, and then somebody was like, "Hey, I got kids off of school." I'm like, "So give them screen time."
There you
go. Yeah, screen time.
Yeah, just turn it up a little louder. Yeah, that's right.
There's your tip for the day. There's your live it out.
If
you're looking for some time with your significant other,
iPad was invented for a reason.
Yeah, right. Give your kids some screen time. That's great. But what does it look like? How do we trust God with this? How do we trust God with the idea of sex and living out this biblical sexual ethic?
Yeah, I think the question that I ask is, how do I, starting today, don't try to undo the past, but starting today, how do I honor God sexually? Right?
Yeah, that's a great point, starting today, because a lot of us carry a lot of that baggage into our relationships.
I think that's where a lot of people, if I've done it wrong or I didn't do it right, then God's perpetually angry with me. And it's like, well, time out. God cares more about your progress than your past.
Yeah.
And man, he wants to come alongside and meet us where we're at, whatever that looks like. And so, and again, I don't have specific answers for the listeners. I think that's where God invites you to go on that adventure with him and go, okay, God, what's the step that you're inviting me to take? Don't read between the lines. You go through what the Bible is teaching and go, God, what does that mean for me? Or if you're in a relationship, what does that mean for us? And I would say for those of you that are single, I think making God the foundation of your relationship is a great way to do that. Think about this biblical sexual ethic as a single person, and just navigate that. Doesn't mean you're second class, but your foundation matters. What you're doing in your single life will influence what your married life will look like. For those of you that are married, God did not invite you to become one with your job or your kids. He says the purpose of marriage is two will become one in marriage. And so as two people become one in marriage, sexuality or your sex life is a part of that. And typically, I listened to a divorce lawyer this past week, and they were like, usually where the divorce starts to fall or the divorce begins is long before lawyers are involved. It's they stopped scheduling it, talking about it, prioritizing just time to connect with each other, work-life balance, or the opposite schedules. Like I'll watch the kids during the day and you work, and then I'll work at night and you watch the kids at night. Well, what happens is you start dissolving. That's what divorce means. You start dissolving that connection, that oneness. And so a couple of practical ways that you can do that as a married person is talk about it.
I was going to say, be intentional, right? Yeah.
Schedule
talk
it.
About it. Schedule it. That's great.
The question I said this weekend is ask the question, does this make you feel good? And the answer should be either yes or not so much that. Why don't you try this? Okay, not so much that. I mean, it sounds weird. Like we think we should be natural masters at this, but it takes 10,000 hours to become a master at something. So why don't you just master this?
I think that's very wise. The open communication. I think that makes the whole process of it a little more beautiful. It makes it one.
That's right.
Not just you
it's not just a physical act.
Yeah, exactly. So, Alex, for parents, for those of us that maybe have a middle school student, a high school student, we assume they're talking about it. Where should I go? What should I do? What next step can I take?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of great ones. Our curriculum we use, it's called Orange.
Yep.
And so they have a podcast for parents, which is called Parent Q Podcast.
Q Podcast. Parents, go listen to that right now. It is so good.
Well, you can actually go to our middle school or high school page, and we have a link to the podcast that talks about talking to your student about sexual integrity through the different phases of their development. And then we'll have a lot more resources on the website by March 1st as well, like the different phase guide, parent conversation guide, some of those pieces. Another just easy one is just I think getting involved in a group with other parents so you can just talk to about it and like, hey, did you talk to your middle school student about this yet? What did you say? How did you handle it when they came home and said they had their first kiss or whatever else it is? Who knows what the conversations are there? And then the biggest one is you just talk to your student about it.
Yes.
Just start bringing it up a little bit. Like, hey, what are you learning about? What are your friends doing or into? Or if you hear something on a song, you're like, hey, what does that mean? Ask the questions, because what questions pull, right?
Yeah, questions pull, answers push, right? Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
Do you have resources for parents who have technology at home on that podcast too?
Orange has resources for that. I think we have a few coming that will be able to put on the website. So
that'd be great.
For parents of students, just keep an eye out in email. There's a whole resource list coming out because ultimately, like Alex is saying and Ben is saying too, our hope is to partner with you and to give you those resources to have those conversations. The group leader is there to assist you, to help you, and we can't say it enough how important it is to just meet that group leader, know who is hanging out with your students, with your kids, because they ultimately want to come alongside of you and help them, your student, with their journey. So
that's huge.
Got a little bit in the student world there, but that's okay. It's super important to be talking about, especially with our our students. So if you've got some next steps to take, whether you're single, whether you're married, whether you are a student or a parent, I think all of us, this conversation, there's something we can take from it. And I think being intentional with this and not just coasting, just like anything in life, is a great way to live that out. Ben, next week, continuing the conversation, we got a special guest coming to hang out with us.
Yeah, Pastor Sweeney, Calvin Sweeney's coming in. And so it's going to be a fun week. He's going to talk a little bit about the practical sides of how do we experience love in our daily lives. And so I think there's a couple other elements that we're going to laugh at.
Awesome.
And so it's going to be a fun week. Practical implication for every relationship, but also for our marriages.
So great. Cool. We're looking forward to it. Next week, week 3 of The Knot, Dr. Calvin Sweeney is going to be here with us. Pastor, Dr. Wrestler. He's got so many cool titles.
That's right.
Whenever I see his resume, I'm always like, man, so
the man.
impressive. The man. That's great. I love that. Awesome. Well, thanks for tuning in to this week's Living It Out podcast. Again, it is our hope that you are reminded that you matter so much and to help live out that truth throughout this week. We'll see you guys next week.